Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the In-House podcast, our space where we discuss issues at the intersection of Muslim identity, popular culture and Islam. Today it is our honour and our privilege to be joined by the editor of 5 Pillars, our brother Roshan Salih. Roshan has been working in the media industry for over 25 years, beginning in local newspaper before moving on into broadcast journalism, working at the London Weekend Television, going through to Al Jazeera, Press TV, Islam Channel, and now the independent Muslim media outlet 5 Pillars. So without further ado, Assalamu alaikum, Roshan. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate
Thanks for inviting
coming down. So you are somebody who, for more or less all of your adult life, have worked within the media industry. So can we rewind a couple of decades and go to a very young Roshan, and
as opposed to the old Roshan you
as
see
opposed
before you
to
now.
the seasoned journalist before us, and where you were at when you were kind of thrown open different career paths. What triggered the journey?
Okay, well, I straight from university I actually fell into teaching because I was a lazy student and I just kind of thought it was an easy thing to do. So I was a teacher for 2 years in Blackpool.
Was it an easy thing to do?
No, it was actually quite difficult. I didn't enjoy it. I quite liked the kids. I didn't like my colleagues. And I didn't like being in one building all the time. And I found it boring. I wasn't very good. And so I got out of that because it wasn't my passion. But my passion actually was always reading and writing.
Interesting.
And so that's what I wanted to do from an early age. So I decided to retrain as a journalist. And I thought, this is a great job. I'll be able to I won't be in one building all my life. I'll be able to travel, meet different people every day, a new subject. I like reading. I like writing. I wasn't someone who was used to public speaking at that point. That came later. But so I retrained as a journalist and I haven't looked back.
So your time as kind of considering journalism as a career, what was the reception like in the community and the family? Were there many others like you?
I think my parents just wanted me to be happy, really, and do something I liked, which I think was pretty good advice, because obviously most Muslim parents, or a lot of them, are like, no, you must become doctor, engineer, whatever, and you must make lots of money, whereas there certainly wasn't a lot of money in journalism when I started.
No.
So as a career choice, wasn't a great one financially to begin with. But I think my parents, they just wanted me to do something that I like doing, because we work, so much of our lives are spent at work. We've got to enjoy it a little bit. Otherwise, it's no matter how much money you're earning, it's a nightmare.
Yeah. So would you say that your kind of journey with journalism or media, as it were, was there a particular naivety you had in what you thought life in the media would look like versus what happened when you entered into the industry?
No, I think my stereotypes have been confirmed during my career, because I thought right at the beginning the mainstream media is out to stitch up Muslims. I remember growing up with the mainstream media, it was Bosnian. Before that, when I was very young, it was the Iraq War, and then it was the Bosnian War. And I thought both times the media...
You mean the Second Gulf War?
The Second Gulf War.
Yes.
So the one in... the first one in 1990.
Yes.
I was a teenager then. And I remember, oh my God, they're stitching up Islam, they're stitching up the Muslims here.
You had that awareness?
I had that awareness then. And then later came the Bosnia War. And again, the Muslims were getting shafted, targeted, misrepresented, etc., massacred. And the media wasn't portraying it in a good light. So those were my formative experiences before I became a journalist. And I thought, right, the mainstream's out to get Muslims. And at the same time, there were a few Muslim publications. There was one called Q News, which is defunct now, which I used to read, all the time. And I thought, I want to get into Muslim media. So from a very early age, I had this twin thing, right? I don't like the mainstream. I don't want to work in the mainstream, but I do want to work in Muslim media, which was a very formative industry at that point.
So you began actually within local newspaper.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about...
So the first, I think, 6 or 7 years of my career was in the mainstream. And it started off very small in a local newspaper. It was called the Maidenhead Advertiser. It was a weekly newspaper. About 30,000 people would read it every week, and small publication. But it was pure journalism. There weren't agendas really, so it was a really good journalistic training. But obviously, it wasn't for me. Maidenhead is a white middle class area. I would be out covering school fates, and there was a bit of coverage of the local football team, which I quite enjoyed.
Yeah.
But it wasn't Muslim journalism, so I didn't enjoy it. But it was a good training.
Yes.
And then I went from there to bigger stuff, I guess. I worked with London Weekend Television, which is quite a big production house, a subsidiary of Granada.
Okay.
And we'd work for, we'd do lifestyle shows, we'd do travel shows, we'd do political shows. We worked for ITV, for the BBC, for Sky, for all these big kind of broadcasters, and millions of people would watch the programs that I worked on.
Yeah.
I mean, I was working on it as quite a low level, as a researcher, then a producer. I wasn't the main guy on these programs by any stretch of the imagination. But again, it was I would say it was kind of very non-Muslim journalism.
Yeah.
Some of it bordered on the I would say verging on the haram, some of the stuff that I worked on. I'm not proud of it. And I remember once, the breaking point for me was when I was basically forced to work on a show making the case for the war in Iraq.
Okay.
And
you were told
I was told
this
is you have to work on it. You have to make the case for the war in Iraq. And I was saying, well, can't I work on the show against the war in Iraq? Because that's my personal beliefs. They said, no, you have to work on this one. This is where the slot's available. If you don't work on it, then you have to you don't have a job. So I worked on it, hating every moment of it. And I was thinking, I can't do this anymore because I'm literally working for the forces of evil here, And that's when I just left mainstream journalism.
So that was that the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I always intended to get out, and that's what I always recommend to Muslim journalists now. If you're in the mainstream, if you're working for The Guardian or the New York Times or the BBC, don't think you've made it, because ultimately you're part of a massive Islamophobic machine. You're a small cog in that machine. You're never going to change the system. The system will eventually crush you. It's a bad place to be. However, it's a good place to get a training, because you'll find very competent media professionals in those big organizations. So learn from them, but eventually, have an exit plan and then take the skills and then put that into Muslim media.
Okay, so Roshan, you potentially have made quite a broad stroke brush kind of characterization of the mainstream. Do you think on any level there's redemption or it's redeemable?
Overall, no. I think it's the biggest purveyor of Islamophobia, disseminator of Islamophobia in the whole world. And it's there to represent state interests. I mean, to one extent or another, all media is propaganda anyway. And it's just a question of what's the sophistication of this propaganda. Even Muslim media is propaganda to a certain extent.
Well, how are you defining propaganda here?
Well, it's pushing a certain agenda. And as 5 pillars, I don't say we're neutral or balanced we're championing Islam. We're defending Islam and Muslims. However, in doing that, we are being accurate. We are being fair to the other side. We're not misportraying even the people that we don't like, and that's the best you can get. But I think people, organizations like the BBC that say they're neutral and balanced and impartial, they're just lying, ultimately. Be honest, just say, no, we're pushing a state agenda here, but we're trying to be as fair as we possibly can while pushing that agenda. That would be the truth.
So what's the difference between the BBC's claim to impartiality versus 5 Pillars' claim to impartiality?
Well, obviously, the BBC is an organisation that's funded to, billions of pounds every year, and we're just a little bit underneath that, But yeah, it's... no, I would say the sophistication.
It comes down? You think it's hardcore finances? It boils down to
obviously we could
who
do a lot
controls
more
the purse strings?
I think the comparison between the BBC and 5 Pillars is not a great one.
I'm talking the claim to integrity here.
Yes, I understand.
So openly, 5 Pillars will be very clear about the purpose, even the ethos of the organisation, right? And the BBC, every single time there's a kind of flare up in Israel, every time there's reporting on the Rohingya, of the Hindu nationalism, and there's a flurry of complaints from the public, talking about disproportionate coverage or the way that victims are portrayed as aggressors, etc., etc. There's a very clear and kind of rehearsed response from the BBC with claims to impartiality. And the BBC, amongst other news outlets, will claim that they get a similar amount of kind of hate from those with the Zionist agenda, claiming that they're being unfair to them.
Yeah.
So where exactly is the distinction with impartiality?
Okay, so, all right, if you want me to ask you a question directly, so I would say both Five Pillars and the BBC are both doing propaganda. However, we are open about our agenda. The BBC is not. And we're honest about our agenda. Our agenda is to champion Islam and to defend Islam and Muslims. But we do it in a way where we are bringing acceptable or very high, I would say, journalistic standards to the table and applying them in a fair and accurate way. So we're not misrepresenting anybody. When we do our stories, we fact check, etc., etc. And we also do give the other point of view as well, in the context of who we are. What the BBC does is say we are neutral. We are impartial. We represent all sides fairly. When you can just look at their coverage of Israel-Palestine, it's like David versus Goliath, but they portray it as two equals, Look at their coverage of the World Cup now, and, the LGBT controversy in the World Cup. And look at the coverage of the Muslim world in general, and even Afghanistan. Maybe we could talk a bit about Afghanistan later. Yes. They are pushing a state agenda because they're financed by the British state, and they are financed by the state because ultimately the government sets the level of taxpayer money which goes to the BBC.
Yes.
So it's the same thing. And some parts of the BBC, like the World Service, I think actually is directly funded from the Foreign Office.
Yes.
So they are pushing a British state cultural and political agenda, but they're not honest about it. If they were honest about it, then I think a lot of Muslims would cut them a bit more slack, quite frankly.
Do you feel that the claims to kind of the fact-checking, the integrity, the truthfulness with which Five Pillars operates, if a mainstream consumer of the news, a non-Muslim, were to have a read, trawl through kind of the news archives, do you feel like they would walk away with the impression that, yes, this is from this focuses on Muslim issues, however, the content is still rigorous?
I think they would. You know why? Because we're regulated. We're actually regulated by Impress, which is one of the two major media regulators, or one of the three major media regulators in this country. And they're non-Muslims, by the way. They're not Muslims.
What does that regulation involve?
We have to follow a broadcast code on things like impartiality, on things like harassment, how we deal with stories involving children, accuracy. And any member of the public, if they're not happy with one of our stories, or any of our stories, can complain to that independent body.
Okay.
They will investigate, and they have the power to sanction us, to fine us, to make us apologize, etc., etc. So it's literally an outside body, and we're the only regulated Muslim media publication in the whole world. Yeah.
So give us an inside scoop then, Roshan. Have you landed in hot water with?
Yes. Yeah. They sanctioned us for. There's been many investigations against us. Probably
on similar topics or across
on many,
the board?
It's usually LGBT issues or Palestine, Israel. We've had about 40 complaints made against us in 3 years.
Okay.
We've been exonerated 39 times. We were. Do you want me to give you the details here? We were found. All right. We were found guilty by Impress of effectively, I wouldn't say inciting hatred, but stepping over the line when it came to targeting the LGBT community.
Okay.
Completely unjustified. One of the deputy editor of Five Pillars went to Prophet Lut's cave in Jordan, and outside of that cave, he basically outlined the orthodox normative Islamic position on same-sex relations, and he also said that it was wrong for any Muslim to target anyone in the LGBT community, but it was also wrong for the LGBT community to try to impose their views on Muslims. That's all he said.
Yeah.
I have the video, anyone can see it.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, the non-Muslim secularists at Impress found us guilty of basically inciting hatred against the LGBT community. So we had to apologize, completely unjustified. We thought of actually leaving Impress on a matter of principle because we couldn't accept that we'd done anything wrong. And we've never been sued. We've never broken the law. So we felt they had gone too far.
Yeah.
We took Shura with Islamic scholars, and they advised us to stay within Impress, this media regulator, under protest. That's what we did.
Okay. So, I mean, this brings up issues to do with actual freedom in regulation, right? So it's not the case then that if you are an independent media outlet, you have the absolute freedom to say, do and be as you please.
You can if you most Muslim media or independent media is not regulated. We chose to become part of that regulator because we wanted to give our audience trust in us and credibility, and we wanted to give them an option to complain about us if they weren't satisfied with how we have dealt with their complaints. So it's all about trust and credibility in our eyes. That's why we voluntarily belong to this body. Now, I would say most independent media don't care about trust and credibility. They say whatever they want to say, and they don't obey any rules, whereas we do.
This is exactly what I think actually goes over many people's heads, is the idea that obviously we're living in an age now where there is a kind of disillusionment with mainstream media, and when you now have the platforms, or you can create without too much trouble alternative platforms through which your views, however extreme or however against the mainstream they are, you will find platforms in order to...
This is why we need, sister, we need a Muslim media regulator.
Yes.
That is comprised of shuyukh, media professionals, other professionals, maybe lawyers, and all Muslim media, not only in this country but abroad, I feel should belong to this body, should sign up to this body and adhere by this body's codes.
Yes.
And that would give confidence in Muslims, because let's face it, Muslims don't really, they don't like the mainstream, but they can still consume the mainstream more than they do the Muslim media, because at the moment the Muslim media isn't up to scratch.
Yes. So we jumped from mainstream straight into the other end, right, with independent Muslim media. In the middle, you had a stint at Al Jazeera.
Yes, I did,
right?
yes.
A lengthy stint, was it?
Yeah, 3 years. Yeah.
3 years, and you were based in
Doha,
the center of a lot of attention right now. What did you find, kind of broadly speaking, the difference between mainstream state-sponsored versus independent?
Okay, there's pros and cons. I felt a lot more at home at Al Jazeera.
Why?
Because, I was living in a Muslim country. I learned Arabic out there. There's a mosque on every corner. Although Qatar is still quite a westernized society, so I could have gone there and not learned a word of Arabic, and not gone to any mosques, and gone and spent my time in the shopping malls.
Right. Many foreign workers.
But I made the effort, and it's easy, and it's nicer weather, quite frankly, and it's a nice family atmosphere.
So do you think for the Muslim consumer or even the Muslim journalist, it's just picking the best fit for your politics?
Yeah, at the time, obviously, 5 Pillars didn't exist then, and for me it's like, right, I've got the choice of working in mainstream media where I only believe in 10% of what's going on, or working for Al Jazeera where I believe in 70% of what's going on.
Okay.
So otherwise I'm unemployed, right?
Yes.
So for me that was the choice, and I did feel more comfortable at Al Jazeera, much more than I did in the mainstream media. And ultimately, if we look at it in the whole, Al Jazeera has overall been a force for good, no doubt about it. It has democratized the discourse in the Arab world in particular. It's been a definite alternative to the West, but it's still not Islamic enough for me.
Right, so this was my question. You kind of threw out 70%, right? So there was something inside you, that 30% that was niggling away. You had to kind of know when to zip up when you needed to. What was that impetus that got you thinking, you know what I actually really need to do is just start from the ground up and go completely independent?
Yes. Well, it was while I was working in Press TV, because obviously then I moved from, Qatari-sponsored media to Iranian-sponsored media, right?
This is an interesting shift,
So, and I actually spent more time at Press TV than I did at Al Jazeera. And again, 70% of the stuff that I was doing, I was quite happy with.
You were?
Yeah, I was, yeah. But then issues started happening like Syria and, Iraq and Syria.
Yeah.
And there were a few things that I didn't feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
And then that's when I really started 5 Pillars. And I did it as a labor of love because I thought, actually, I've got so many contacts, both in Britain and abroad, and I've got a certain expertise. I need to put this into something where I'm in the driving seat. And
Roshan,
I'm calling the shots, not somebody else.
can I probe you there? So the leap maybe between Al Jazeera and Press TV.
Yeah.
How explicit is the kind of narrative that you are told to abide by? Is it literally, oh, here's a bunch of journalists, this is our perspective on X issue, off you go? Or is it an unspoken thing where you understand the parameters?
No, I think Press TV, obviously that's Iranian, it's for foreign media. So there's more freedom for an Iranian foreign channel than there is for an Iranian domestic channel.
Right.
So a lot of the journalists they hired, or most of them, were non-Muslim. Some were Jewish, some were atheists, some were Christian.
And they
a lot of them were
ideologically didn't have
Sunni,
an issue?
there were Sunnis and Shias working in there as well.
Okay, so the atmosphere was very mixed.
Believe it or not, it was quite free. Me as a Sunni Muslim, I never got any pressure to convert to Shia Islam.
Yeah.
I never got any pressure to even go against any of my beliefs, really, because they kind of coincided and they were happy to give me free rein. They trusted me as a journalist. The only time where there was any clash was when we were talking about Iran. And if there was something, and they would check my scripts on Iran closer than any other story. And that's not, and because if I was working at Al Jazeera, they would do the same for Qatar. France 24, the same for France,
Yes.
So it was, I expected it.
Part of the territory.
And most of the time, I have to say, I was comfortable. But obviously, when the Syria war started, that's when, I mean, this was at a time also when Sunnis and Shias didn't have too much of an issue with each other. And there was quite a lot of collaboration on areas of concern. And that there wasn't the sectarian atmosphere we live in today. That really started after 2011 and the Syria war. Yeah.
It sounds though what you're saying is that you will always be treading a particular kind of delicate balance where if you're with kind of state-owned TV or mainstream, for as long as it's good, and when it's not.
That is the danger of state-sponsored, Islamic or Muslim journalism, is that when the state changes its mind, so do you. Whereas I want to work somewhere where the principles are based on Quran and Sunnah, and the principles are eternal and unchanging. And you're never going to get this kind of sudden policy shift based on paymasters.
When the sudden policy shifts do occur in quite a drastic way, is it literally you are told, hey, you know what, we're not buddies with Egypt anymore, we're going to focus on these kinds of negative news stories, or we're going to bolster?
Yeah, and maybe not as, I don't think they send out memos necessarily, or sometimes they do. They actually do sometimes. It's more like top journalists in an organization will meet with management, they will be told verbally what the score is, and then the message will percolate downwards to underlings, to producers, researchers, journalists, whatever. That's usually how it happens. But yeah, it's not as if Vladimir Putin or Ayatollah Khamenei walks into the newsroom and says, no, this is the way it is. It doesn't like that.
Well, I mean, there's obviously layers of subtlety, but do you think there's an analogy to be made then with how narratives like within mainstream with, BBC or CNN or Fox, for example, do you think there's conversations in very small elite top circles? They're made first.
Yeah.
And is this conspiratorial, or is this actually how it runs?
It's always gone on. I mean, obviously, a media is a reflection of the state in which that media is based.
Yes.
So obviously the BBC, there is more freedom in the BBC because Britain is by and large a stable, rich country, and it can tolerate a level of criticism because criticism isn't a threat.
Yes.
Whereas in Iran, for example, a certain level of criticism could lead to a revolution.
Yes.
So they keep a lid on it.
Yes.
Whereas here, me spouting off about British foreign policy, it's not going to lead to any revolution, and therefore the British state, they might not like what I'm saying, but they tolerate it to a certain extent, even though they still do hack my phone, and they still do all kinds of keep me off social media and all that kind of stuff, which goes on behind the scene. And I can't prove any of that, but I know it's happening, and any Muslim activist will tell you it happens to them as well. But what I'm trying to say is that at the BBC, so the level of freedom to report and the level of criticism in the BBC will probably be higher than in most organizations, simply because it's coming from a stable, rich state which can tolerate criticism, because criticism is not a threat. At the same time, MI5 and MI6 will have connections with the BBC, and the intelligence services will have those connections at higher levels. At the same time, they're culturally, a lot of the head honchos at the BBC would have gone to school with the Prime Minister and cabinet ministers and the head of MI5. So that old boy network is there, and it's behind the scenes. I'm not saying 12 people are meeting in a room and it's the protocols of the elders of the BBC or something like that. Yeah. But they are part of the same state. They are part of the same culture. They are pursuing the same goals. And what happens at the top level will definitely percolate downwards.
So it's been, 100 years now with, this year was 100 years since the BBC kind of came into fruition. Do you think it's this being able to tolerate that level of, criticism or pushback against a narrative is a sign of an organisation that has matured?
No, well, actually it's getting worse now, because now... there's a pushback because mainstream media is in crisis, especially since the advent of social media.
Yes.
And people have gone elsewhere and they've got a massive microphone elsewhere. So now you'll find these attempts to put pressure on social media organizations like Facebook and Twitter, often behind the scenes, in the name of combating misinformation and fake news. Now when we've all heard that buzzword, fake news. Now, people need to adjust their mindset when they think about, because who do we as a public think is the major disseminator of fake news? We think it's people on social media, people on YouTube, people who've got a microphone. Actually, no. The main disseminator of fake news is the mainstream media. Who beat the drum? If I say something wrong on social media, it's not really going to have much of an effect. When the BBC, which has an audience of millions, hundreds of millions around the world, beats the drums for a war in a place like Iraq, which is exactly what they did, what happens? A war happens. Millions die. A country is destroyed. Refugees, they have to leave their homes. It causes upheaval. So when we hear fake news, forget about, and literally they've brainwashed us into thinking that this is such an issue that we have to clamp down on social media. It just means clamping down on alternative views. That's what it really means.
Is this an example then of a kind of...
Can I just say one more thing, Zarina?
Please.
They've banned Russian channels in this country.
Yes, on the outbreak of the Ukraine war.
During the war, they've literally banned alternative views on the situation on Ukraine. So all we can hear now in Britain, this beacon of freedom and democracy, is propaganda about anti-Russian propaganda, basically.
Yes.
And we have no access to even the smallest amount of Russian opinion. This is how scared they are. So the mainstream media is in crisis, and the West is losing its moral values. And I mean, when the West was great, when it was conquering the whole world, it still was underpinned by conservative moral values at home.
Yes.
They've lost that. So the West is in crisis now, and so is its media. And that's why they're lashing out at alternative media.
This whole issue around free speech has actually become a humongous point of contention. Like, there's the mass kind of disenchantment with mainstream media, and then you have got even the term fake news. It's so kind of problematized because both camps use it equally. So what they render as fake to each other is literally just a point of clashing narratives or clashing perspectives. So do you think that, the Russia and Ukraine war, do you feel like the banning of like Russian TV speaks to a much, much greater crisis at play.
It does. I don't think they would have done it 10 years ago when they felt more comfortable about their place in the world. I think they've done it because they feel as though there's a massive threat from maybe a China-Russia axis. That's the main threat, actually. And then a secondary threat maybe from Islam. We used to think that Islam was the major threat to the West after, 9/11, etc. But I think that they've pivoted slightly towards China, because China's a real big deal and they're worried about China. And they're worried about Russia as well.
Years ago, after actually during the Iraq War, when there was a rise in the far right in the UK and the BNP was kind of gaining a lot of political clout, Nick Griffin, if you remember him, right?
Course, yes.
He appeared on Question Time, with David Dimbleby, and there was a humongous uproar and debate around whether somebody like Nick Griffin should be platformed on mainstream, like primetime television, even in the context of a discussion much like we're having now, right? And eventually he was allowed to go on. But if the threat is an alternative opinion being kind of presented to the public, do you think that kind of the ways in which the public are introduced to acceptable and unacceptable perspectives are constantly being kind of presented and taken back just to test the level of backlash?
I think a lot of testing goes on through the media. I mean, often when you see stories, especially in the Sunday papers, they have these anonymous sources. A lot of the stories in Sunday papers are based on anonymous sources. And it's often government ministers or the intelligence services planting stories to test public opinion. They might say, we're going to do this, and then they look to see how people react, and then they follow through on it or they don't follow through on it. So people think the media is this kind of impartial, pristine thing, and all they're trying to do is report on events, but there's a lot of manipulation that goes on behind the scenes. And anything which is powerful, and the media is powerful, it literally has the ability to form opinion and to and in the Arab world we can see it's led to revolutions and wars and stuff like that. Anything that powerful is subject to manipulation, and the media is manipulated.
You have led me really lovely onto a quote actually that speaks about the power of the media manipulation, which is from he was known as the father of modern press relations, but also he penned a book called Propaganda, which we have bandied around that word, but he says the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, and our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. It is they who pull the wires that control the public mind.
Yeah, I would agree with that overall. I think I've just explained a lot of that, haven't I? But it's important that we don't get too conspiratorial, because even as Muslims, when we say something, we have to check whether it's true, and it has to be based on fact. And there is a lot of conspiracy theory in the Muslim world. I don't blame Muslims for being conspiratorial, because so many conspiracies have been enacted upon them that I think it's natural. But sometimes I think we go too far, and we shouldn't get into like Illuminati talk and stuff like that. But I do believe generally, there are hidden hands at work in the political establishments, the financial establishments, the military establishments, etc., that are basically pulling the strings when it comes to the media. The big mainstream media that we all consume every day. And that is not to say that every single journalist is corrupted or every single journalist even knows about this. And I think a lot of journalists, they would laugh at what we're saying now because they generally, it's not their experience. But nevertheless, I would agree with that quote, yes.
I'm going to get you to hold that thought, because I'd really love to explore the whole area of Muslim versus Islamic journalism, and actually the distinction, if any, between the two, and the structures that we have to create as imperative for the future generations. But for now, Roshan, I do want to say many, many thanks for the conversation thus far, and we shall pick up in due course.
Okay.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
From us at Narrative House and the In-House podcast, thank you for watching, and inshallah we shall see you soon.